And hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Faroes Shetland research seminar, where we're going to explore the deep and musical and linguistic connections between Shetland and the Faroe Islands. These Faroes Shetland research symposia have, I would definitely say, been a great success. We've covered a lot of really fascinating material and a whole range of different topics and disciplines. And today's is going to be no different. It's going to be a fascinating exploration of the connections between Shetland and Faroes when it comes to balladry. And our first presenter is going to be Anthony Olsen, who's studying for his PhD with us at the UHI Institute for Northern Studies. Anthony's research focuses on the expression of masculinity in and around the performance of Faroese ballads, and I'm very much enjoying being one of his supervisors. And then, following Anthony, we'll hear from a Shetland musician, Barry Nisbet. Barry's work has recently focused on, I suppose, what we can call musical archaeology, in particular the recovery of the Ballad, which is the largest surviving example of Shetland Norn. Originally, it was collected in Foula in 1774 without a melody, but Barry has spent the last wee while reviving the ballad using a Faroese melody, and his work on the ballad includes a new translation into modern Shetland, providing a unique opportunity to give back this heroic tradition to modern speakers and performers. So it's a wonderful thing to do. So I'm very much looking forward to this webinar, and I'll now pass the baton over to Anthony. But just before we start, of course, please put in your questions in the chat and we will address those later on. But let's continue. Anthony.
So, hello everybody. We are going to be jointly speaking today. So the first part of the presentation that Barry will share is on the history more of the Hildina Ballad and the collection and who has looked at the balladry. And then we will move on to how Barry has basically revived the ballad. So this is quite an exciting project because, of course, those of you that know anything about this, it wasn't written with melody when it was taken down, so there was no notation, and this has been kind of a 2-year project to get back and utilize what is a living tradition in the Faroe Islands to bring back the Hildina Ballad alive. So if Barry could share the presentation,
there we go.
Then we will get started. We have many exciting things to show you today.
You should have it there now.
Here we are. So, next slide. So here you see we start. We're going to start now, and then we're going to go backwards. So here on the side you have a little story from Instagram. So we're very much in 2026 of Barry recording the ballad in Mareel. With a number of balladeers, let's say, singers, that Barry gathered together, and the idea was to, of course, Norn is not a living language in the sense it's a sister language, or it was a sister language to Faroese and Icelandic, so it's West Norse. But of course, Shetland is a living language. So when you think to revive something, it is better for the community. We decided that people could relate to the ballad in their own language, in their own, in their own words, as it were, and then look back of the original. So that's what Barry will discuss later on how he kind of collated that. And then, yeah, we're going to give you the story today. So if we can move on. So first of all, what is the ballad about? So in short, it's recorded in Shetland, of course, on Foula. We'll get to that in a moment. But it's about Hildina. Hildina is the woman behind the ballad, and she's the daughter of a king, and she elopes with the Earl of Orkney while her father is away. And then the king returns, and he's obviously not so happy about this. So he kind of pursues them to Orkney, and Hildina thinks maybe her father and her man should reconcile. So that is attempted, but there's another guy that is a suitor to Hildina who prevents this because, of course, he wants Hildina for himself. And Hildina kills the Earl by beheading him, very pleasant, and throws Hildina's lover's head into her lap. He then asks the king for hand in marriage because, of course, this is a very patriarchal system here that Hildina is not quite signing up for. And the king consents to this, even though this suitor has done something very violent, but he tries to persuade his daughter of this match that he's agreed to, but Hildina has other ideas. So she agrees with conditions, and one of the conditions is that she will serve wine at the wedding. And of course, this wine is cleverly laced with a sedative, causing all the men to fall asleep. And then Hildina arranges for her father to be carried out of the wedding hall and then sets fire to everything. So everyone is burnt, apart from her and her father. So very strong-minded woman. And this is 35 stanzas. So this quite condensed story is told quite well in this. And if we can move on. And I've given you a little bit of like where these types of balladry are from. So this just goes through what we're going to talk about. So we're going to fill your hour here. So we're going to talk about the starting points of the project and then give a little history and scholarly approach, cover a bit of the manuscripts. And then, of course, we're going to talk about the kind of, there's three very important people in this, apart from Barry and me. We're not as important as George Lowe or William of Gutterm, of course. So there's Hildina, there's George Lowe, and there's the guy that the ballad was taken down from. And then Barry will talk about how this ballad has been resuscitated. So we can click forward. So for those of you that are not familiar with the area, you'll see Foula with Fair Isle around Shetland are islands that are a little bit outside of the archipelago. So Foula is on the west of Shetland, and you can easily get there by plane these days or by boat. But you can imagine that back in the 1800s, it was quite a trip to get from mainland Scotland up through Orkney and then across to Shetland and then across to Foula. And of course, the sister archipelago of the Faroes is just a hop, skip, and a jump across the North Atlantic. And so we have these island archipelagos, and they have their own traditions and their own histories. But we do see that, and this is why the Hildina Ballad has a type number in the heroic ballads of the types of Scandinavian balladry, because it is linked with this larger Nordic balladry tradition, which is very much alive today in the Faroe Islands. We move on.
I would just add one thing to the
Yeah.
map, in that I think today, if we look at Shetland as an extension of the road network, it becomes a remote part of Scotland. But for a seafarer, Shetland is right there on this same map as a crossroads.
Yes. Yes, I'm not sure I would sign up to be in one of those boats, but and this is a more detailed map of Foula. This is from the National Library of Scotland, and later on, we have another map, so we can pinpoint where the farm is, where the ballad was taken down. Yeah, we're good to move on. And this is was the fancy building of Mareel. So this is where the ballad was recorded. This is in Lerwick. So now you get why we have the title that we have between these two places in Shetland. And if you click forward, when we first met, we decided that we needed some kind of joint position. Obviously, we thought it was very cool to revive the ballad within a plausible traditional framework. So using the academic research on the ballad and using what we know from the melodies in the Faroe Islands and in other Nordic ballad traditions. So as I've said previously, there was no melody when it was recited or written down. And historically, lots of linguistics in the academy have naturally discussed the language of the ballad, because of course the ballad was taken down phonetically and not by a Norn speaker. And so when you actually have living traditions, so that would be the fiddle in Shetland and the ballad dance in the Faroe, which we thought were the two closest, we could kind of lean on these and see what could be created from what we had. But of course, when you're dealing with melody and lyrics, let's say narrative in lyric literature form, you need to make sure that everything flows, and Barry will talk about that later on. And one of our starting points also was that nobody owns this ballad, so it was a little bit like, oh, who are we to come in and rework this ballad and put a melody to this ballad, and who are we to say that we can do this? But actually this is a manuscript, and I know that singers in the Gaelic tradition like Margaret Stewart have gone to the manuscript archives and revived ballads in the Scottish Gaelic tradition. So this is something that we're building on. Well, other people have done this before us, basically. And you have the Norn on the side of this. So we met in Scalawa, and that is in Shetland on the west coast. It's the second largest town after Lerwick in Shetland. And we started looking at the available academic literature before. Barry had already familiarized himself with some of this. And this book by Marianne Clausen has been the grail to go to every time. Marianne Clausen is a Danish musicologist, and she wrote and compiled a number of books about Faroese musical traditions, from the Kingo songs to the Shalder and nursery rhymes, and also the Danish ballads that were, or Faroese ballads that are sung in Danish, let's say. And so the idea was that how would we pick a melody and a refrain? And so we went through what I mentioned earlier, these type numbers. So Hildina is E, as in heroic, and it has a type number, whether it's about revenge or woman flees her lover. There's many types, and within these close types, we decided that we would pick 5. And these have been looked at by Frances Fisher in her PhD thesis back in '99, where she had some suggestions of what would be a cognate ballad to Hildina. So that was our starting position. And we're talking about 250 years here. So this is also in the Faroe Islands. Johannes Patterson has this very beautiful book that is called the Gold Book. You can see the gold reflecting on the picture here. This was published in 1925. So there was actually an event just now in the Faroe Islands in January marking the 100 years of this book. And the Patterson collection of also has some melodies in it, written down notations. And also one of the things in the living tradition is the use of a refrain between the stanzas. So there is no refrain either in the Hildina Ballad. So when you sing the ballad in chain dance, you begin with the opening, and then there's a stanza, and then there's a refrain. And the refrain everyone sings. I mean, people also sing the ballad if they know the ballad. And there is a skipper, someone who's in charge of the ballad, who leads the ballad. And so actually, it's quite fitting that we're having 100 years of the Gold Book and 250 years of the Hildina Ballad, and one of the refrains and melodies that we've picked is from a ballad that's in this book. So now we're going to move on to, and here you have the refrain at the side, or the melody. And so when we looked at the TSB numbers, the type number, that they're based on genres, we looked at the ones that were similar to Hildina, and then there's also these numbers that are after each of the Faroese ballads. They're called CCF numbers. They are also catalogue numbers of the Faroese ballads. So the kvae that are sung in Faroese have CCF numbers. The ballads that are sung in Danish have DGF numbers. So relating to the different traditions in how they're noted down in the cataloguing system. And so these are the 5 that we picked. And in the end, after looking at the various refrains and translating the refrains from each of these ballads, the ballads, they don't have set refrains actually. You can have different refrains with some ballads, and different melodies, I should say. So we chose Finnur here. We can move on. And here, just to give you a overview, a visual overview, I'm not going to talk about this. You can see that this ballad collected in 1774, it was following on a tradition when the description of the Isles of Orkney was written by James Wallace in 1683, and he had collected Orcadian Norn on his trips. So you're starting in 1683, and Shetland kind of lagged behind a little bit. And then you have various academics that have done work with the transcription. They've done work with searching for other types of Norn, but George Lowe's manuscript took a while to be published. So even though he wrote it down in 1774, it wasn't published for another, over 100 years, 1879. We can move on. And now I have a second timeline here of the scholarly works between 1900 and 1939. So there has been various versions or attempts to look at the ballad, either from a musical point of view by Gunnar Nielsen, in the sense of putting it within another type of tradition. So that's kind of rare, but most people, like Marius Hegstedt, looked at the ballad from, they translated it back to Old Norse, and then they translated it into a modern West, so Nynorsk in this case, so West Norwegian, let's say. And then there was also English translation. So a few people attempted to approach the ballad. And then the last slide in the scholarly works, we see that, yes, correct. We see that between 84 and now, there's been a kind of uptake in various, there's been master's thesis, which I know that Barry used by Bjartner, who is Faroese. And there's been other studies that looked at the literary context and within, so Francis Fisher's work on the comparison of ballads in Scotland and the Faroe Islands. So you see that there's been a kind of uptake, but still these are within more narrative, or as you see with Krista Lindquist, it's phonological and morphological. So we're still not putting this to music at this point. And we move on. And then you have the translations. So you have 4 lines in Faroese that have been translated in 2024. And then you have Barry's translation into Shetland in 2025. There was a Bookmall translation in 2021. And previous to that, there has been a few English translations. They're usually quite flowery, so over embellished and over archaic. And then there have been more thorough translations. And of course, with Norse studies, you also get a German one thrown in for free. If we move on. And here is the manuscript. So the manuscript is quite large. It's larger than A4. So you see it sitting here on a cushion. It's stored at the special collections in Edinburgh University because it was owned by David Lang in Edinburgh. So it doesn't sit in Shetland. It sits in Edinburgh because it was a commission, and that I will talk about in a moment, on a request by a certain Mr. Pennant. And so he left Strømnes, missing an R there. He left Strømnes on 1774, in 1774. If we move on. And here is the manuscript again. And the manuscript is quite beautifully written. Here is the page that's dedicated to Foula, not specifically the ballad, but there are drawings also that George Lowe did in the manuscript. So you have a very good looking, very easy to read, accessible manuscript, which in manuscript studies is sometimes quite unusual. So, and it's yeah, the manuscript is quite beautiful, actually. And if we move on, have a quick photograph of the types of work that has been done linguistically. This is Hagstad's work, where he's gone through the types of words that are used in the ballad and what they can be related to in either Norse or Norwegian. So everyone has been quite focused on the language, because the language being taken down phonetically by a Scots speaker rather than a Norn speaker, and maybe the Norn speaker didn't have fluent Norn. We will not know that because it was taken down phonetically. So there are some issues with the ballad, but the narrative you can read easily. If we move forward. And I have a few slides on the life of George Lowe, so you know who he is. He was born in 1747, and he was the son of a Kirk officer and a woman called Isabel Cooper. And what's interesting is that even though his father died when he was 13, and he came from a humble, his grandfather was a farmer on life renting. He actually went on to have university education, and this was the thing that got him to creating manuscripts and studying history and being interested in these things, and also meeting a whole group of patrons that enabled him to have his trip to Shetland funded. So he went to actually St Andrews in 1766. If we move on. And the point here is that his motivation was actually natural history in the beginning. And this has correlations with the Faroe Islands, because one of the first ballad books that was written in the Faroe Islands was by a guy called Lungbe, and he was a botanist. So there is this, you have naturalists that go to these islands on investigations that are paid by some patron, and they end up collecting ballads. So make of that what you will. But the important thing here is that he met, when he was a minister in Orkney, he met Sir Joseph Banks, who was at the time the 21st president of the Royal Society. And he was journeying back from Iceland, which was the first British scientific expedition to Iceland, with Dr. Lind and Dr. Solander. And through Sir Joseph Banks, he met Thomas Pennant. He was introduced to the Welsh naturalist Thomas Pennant. And this was the motivation that took him to Shetland, to write about these islands in the north from a botanical perspective. We move on. And then, of course, time passes, and after being minister for 21 years, he actually dies shortly shy of 49. And in this time, he was continually trying to get his manuscript published. So he was kind of let down by some of his patrons, where they were promising things, and he was given other commissions, and he was very much in contact. There's letters between these men, these patrons that he had. But yeah, he gets married. His wife dies in childbirth. So it's he doesn't see his manuscript published in his lifetime, sadly enough. If we move on. And now I will just go through quickly the patrons of George Lowe, and they are a very, very auspicious lot. And we start with Sir Joseph Banks, I think. And here he is. So you will understand how auspicious and fancy these patrons are by the fact that you can find their paintings in oil on canvas in the National Portrait Gallery in London. So I will not spend time on these, but just for you to have an understanding of the connections that Lowe had that paid for him to go to Shetland and do this study and ultimately collect the Norn Ballad from William Henry in Foula.
Something
yes?
I would add about Banks is that when he and Solander came to Orkney, they'd been back from the Pacific Ocean as part of the Endeavour and Captain Cook's first expedition for less than a year. So they would have been inspiring company.
Yes, yes. For sure, you see him with his globe here. And then we go to the next man, Thomas Pennant. And Thomas Pennant was the guy that George Lowe had the most contact with. And he was also corresponding with the Royal Swedish Society of Science through Linnaeus. So there was this kind of ecosystem that George Lowe was a minor part of, as a kind of, I suppose, researcher, sent envoy to Shetland, and because he lived in Orkney. So it was very much time and place specific. He was minister in Orkney, which meant that he had access to things, but also he utilized these patrons to send him books and information and give him kind of tasks whilst he was minister. We move on. And this is George Patton. George Patton was the man that kind of, he corresponded with between Pennant. So he kind of acted as an intermediary, and he was he was an antiquarian and bibliographer, and he was in Edinburgh and connected to the church. So there was another connection to George Lowe through the church there. They all have very fancy wigs. We move on. And this guy I could only find an etching of, but still from the National Portrait Gallery. And he was a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries and fellow of the Royal Society. And his collection is partly at the Bodleian Library also. And these are as I said, they're part of the ecosystem. So in correspondence to who is going to publish, who is going to finance, who is going to send Lowe information in terms of books that he can utilize for his studies and for his manuscript. We move on. And then, of course, you get into the earldom of Orkney and the lordship of Shetland, and who has power to assign the appointment of ministers. So Sir Lawrence Dundas, the first baronet, he not necessarily would have met George Lowe, but he definitely would have signed the documents that enabled George Lowe to be appointed minister in Orkney. We move on to the next man. And here we have the 14th Earl of Morton, and he's tangentially connected to George Lowe, maybe one removed, through the Royal Society. And so you have different presidents in these years, and they are all connected in what they want to look at, because they are all kind of semi-interested in mapping the British Isles and understanding these northern isles in the north that don't have they kind of need to acquire information on. Next. And then you have the 11th Earl of Buchanan. And we can move on. So these are all corresponding members of the Society of the Antiquities of Scotland. And these are the types of books that he was loaned from these patrons to help him complete his tasks. He was also interested in creating a history of the Orkney Islands, or Orkney. And you can see in these types of books that he was very, he would have studied in Latin at St Andrews. So he was, even though he was from a humble background, he was self-educated and educated at university. But he didn't necessarily have access to these types of things in Orkney. We move on. And you can see in these correspondence between Pennant and Patton, two of the men earlier, that he says, "I rejoice that Mr. Lowe has got my books, being sure he will make good use of them. I do my best to stimulate him to visit Shetland." Maybe, I'm not sure why he needed to be stimulated to visit Shetland, but which he will complete the history of our isles. So you can see through the mentions of Saxo Grammaticus and the history of the Orcades and how they viewed this. They felt that there was a missing link. There was something missing in their knowledge of these Northern Isles. If we move on. And this is just about the motivation of the natural history. So there's lots of drawings in the different manuscript collections of George Lowe. So he was also artistically gifted. So he was a very talented man. It's very unfortunate that he didn't get his chips when he was alive. And then he was also interested in the bird and the fish plant life as well as the antiquity. We move on. And then we get to, you see on the side, this is another page from the manuscript where he writes down some words in Norn and what their equivalent would be in Scottish Standard English. And he references for the first time Symposium, so a kind of heroic ballad that would be danced to and is danced to today in the Faroe Islands. And he wants this to, so he's taken down the ballad and he wants this to be sent to Dr. Percy to be able to make sense, if you like, of this ballad. Because, of course, the Right Reverend Thomas Percy, the Bishop of Dromore, was the man behind the relics of ancient English poetry. So there was a correlation between what was going on in Scotland and Shetland to what Percy had published in 1765. So the interest in Symposium didn't come out of nowhere. We move on. And then you have the first page of where he has written down the first stanzas of the ballad. And he says to Mr. Patton, "I do not remember if I left you a copy of a Norn ballad, which I got in Foula. I wish you would try if Dr. Percy could make anything of it." And then what's interesting here is that he talks about the honest countryman's mouth, who could neither read nor write. We have to take him at his word on that, but had the most retentive memory I have ever heard of. He, I'm afraid, is by the time dead, as he was then old and much decayed. But when I saw him, he was so much pleased with my curiosity, and now and then a dram of gin, that he repeated and sung the whole day. Unfortunately, he only wrote down the ballad, so he must have sung other things with George Lowe also, but they do not get documented. It's the ballad and a few other little sentences that get documented. We go forward. And now we are with William. And this is where we see that he says he cannot answer for the orthography. I wrote it as an old man pronounced it, nor could he assist me in this particular. I mean, William Henry was not a Norn teacher, so that was not his job to teach George Lowe the fineries of what he was singing. But also we have, thankfully, from George Lowe, we have the name of the person, the informant. So we have William Henry, the man that sang the ballad. And we have that he was a farmer and where that farm was in Foula. And then he divides the three kinds of poetry that were used in Norn that were repeated and sung by the old men. He doesn't specify who these other old men are. And then there's the ballad or romance, I suppose, the visa, now commonly sung to dances or dancers, and the simple song. So he makes a delineation, but he doesn't specify anything else that he's collected, or whether after those drams of gin he was having too much of a good time and thought, now I've written down the Norn ballad, I'm good to go. So we will not know. And if we move on. And here, I think Barry can say something about this, because we had a conversation last night about tracking this down.
Yeah, so I asked a few Foula friends if they could pinpoint exactly where Gutterm was, and they sent me fairly accurate diagrams. It's a ruin now. I think you would just see the lowest stones of the croft still forming the shape of the building. I would imagine the upper stones have been taken for other buildings. But yeah, Gutterm is still there. You could still visit the house, but it is just an outline of a house these days. But it's in the hymn tune in the south end of Foula. And yeah, that arrow indicates the position. I did put a footnote on this slide too, because I was interested in the fact that it was Gutterm was recorded by Lowe, and today in Foula it's known as Guttrun. And right through the recording of the Hildina Ballad, there's word endings with an N that Bjarni Stanton states that the original Old Norse might have had an M, so that seems to suggest some sort of consistency.
So now we can pinpoint where the man lived. And then we move on, which I think is I think this is my last slide. And so if you would want to read about all of this ecosystem and the patrons behind George Lowe's work, there is a very good article in Culture Unbound by Linda Anderson Burnett. So I have utilized some of that and also given them faces and oil paintings. But she states that by naming the man Lowe moreover added veracity to the Old Norn ballad. Lowe would no doubt have been aware of the controversy surrounding the authenticity of the alleged ancient Oceanic poems that James Macpherson collected in the late 1750s and 1760s, and he would therefore probably be keen to include a detailed narrative of how he came across this old ballad in order to verify it. So in that sense, we are happy for the controversy surrounding the Ossianic ballads, because that meant that George Lowe was invested in naming William Henry and where William Henry came from. And I think now I hand over to Barry.
Well, thanks very much, Anthony. Yeah, I'll go into my my part in the process. Am I, yeah, visible there? So yeah, after we're chats and conversations and some study that Anthony helped to direct me to, I was very keen to carry out this task. And but I was aware I would need some help to do it, because it would be a lot of work, and I felt that without some sort of funding, it would be more work than I would be able to commit the time to. So I was very fortunate in getting some funding from Creative Scotland to cover my time and some travel as well, to spend a lot of 2025 working on the Hildina Ballad. I was very keen to approach it and try to do a direct translation where possible, because while translations had been made into English and German and Norwegian, I felt it would be a lot more authentic if I could go directly from the Norn. So that meant I was very keen to understand the every single word and what that word was doing in every single sentence in the ballad. So I referred to a lot of papers, and the ones I found the most useful was the ones I've listed here: Sophus Bugge, Marius Egstad, Egil Lehmann. Jon Helgesen, who gave a talk at a presentation in Shetland in 1951, had done a very sort of grounded and direct rendering of it, which I found extremely useful. And of course, Bjarne Stenton's paper from 2016. And in 2025, Michael Barnes published a journal article that very pertinently had some ideas about how anyone doing a modern rendering in English of the Hildina Ballad might approach it, which I found very useful as well. I was a Norwegian speaker, not a good speaker, but I have an understanding of the Norwegian language, which helped a lot. And I was able to refer to the neighbouring languages, Faroese, Bokmål and Landsmål, and I used the Clisby Vigfusson Old Norse dictionary to try to help me understand exactly what was going on in the words, and I was able to get an understanding of the case system and how the word endings would work. In working through the text, again, I was approaching it as a musician, not as a linguist or an academic. So I was very keen to make sure everything worked musically and to understand the stresses and language. So from the beginning, I had a dummy melody that I used, which I built up in the Faroese sort of structure and rhythm. And that really helped me to go through the original language as well and try to understand what was going on. So I used a couple of documents to help me to settle on my translation. First of all, I went through the whole ballad word for word and the various translations and papers that had been done before, and just tried to understand why they'd come to those decisions, and also to decide on which rendering I found the most plausible and agreed the most with. And then on the right, I presented it for my own use, with George Low's original in red, Jon Helgeson's rendering in the yellow and blue, Bjarne Stenton's Old Norse translation, an English rendering, the Shetland Norn reconstructions that I preferred from the various translations, and then finally my own Shetland rendering in the purple. So while this was all going on, it was absolutely vital for me to travel to Faroe, and it was vital as well to be there at a time when Anthony was there to help me meet the right people and to understand a lot more about how the ballads are presented and danced to in Faroe, and also just how the Faroese folk relate to their own ballads. So I was there in April for 10 days, and again, that was part of my funding application package from Creative Scotland. Absolutely amazed by Faroe on my first ever visit to the islands, and again, so much from it. And I was very keen to meet a lot of the key players in the Faroese music scene and the ballad scene. So I'd managed to make contact with Christian Black, who has a long-standing relationship with Shetland and Faroe and Scotland and Denmark, and is an absolute expert in Scandinavian music and Scottish music, and often how the two relate. So I had a very good chat with Christian, and then Anthony introduced me to Tota Arnardóttir, who is a very keen dancer, ballad singer, and friend. And I'd also been given introductions to Erlendur Simonsen, who I visited and found was an absolutely passionate scholar of Faroese music, history, tradition. He showed me numerous books and played me numerous CDs and explained a lot about how the Faroese ballad tradition works. Gunnar Restorff was the head of the National Association for Promoting Faroese Chain Dance. Again, I had some very useful conversations with him. And Kari Sverrisson, Tota's husband, who was again a very keen musician, dancer, ballad singer, and tradition bearer. So Anthony had arranged for us to attend a ballad dancing evening in Funningur, up in the north end of Eysturoy, and absolutely illuminating to see, first of all, to be there when everyone arrived at the dance hall, at the Dansestova, and just to sense the excitement prior to a ballad evening, I felt was as useful as witnessing the ballads and the dancing itself. Just the sheer excitement people felt that what they were about to do. It felt very much like an event for locals. It wasn't put on in any way. I felt like I was there by the grace of the community, as opposed to anything being done for anyone else's benefit. So it was a very authentic ballad evening. And I felt how it was to join the dance, and the ballad made so much more sense while you dance it, as opposed to while standing on as an onlooker. So incredibly useful to witness that. And I think 7 ballads were danced that evening. Would that be right, Anthony?
Yeah, about that. I mean, back and forth.
I forget the names of them all, but the Sinclair Ballad was one of them, and I was amused at the end of that dance for a fairly large Faroese man to turn to me and say in Norwegian, "There, now the Scottish are all dead." So a very authentic and slightly intimidating experience attending a ballad dancing night in Funningur. It was fantastic. This is a gathering of us before we went up to the Dansestova. That's Tota there, second from the left, Anthony and myself. And this is the Dansestova itself, inside which all the dancing's going on. And you can see the way the windows are steaming up, and you could really feel the energy emanating from the building. So yeah, as Anthony mentioned earlier, he'd provided me with 5 different ballads that I might like to look at to use to render the Hildina Ballad. And again, I had lots of conversations about this because Anthony's suggestion had been that it could be a Faroese ballad melody could be used for the Hildina. And in numerous conversations with Faroese musicians, again, I discussed this and they all agreed. They all said it's very common in in the Faroe Islands, for a ballad to be sung to a different melody. The melodies can often be interchangeable. Many ballads are sung to a variety of melodies. And of course, the other interesting thing was that often the refrains would travel with the melody as opposed to with the ballad. So I found that very interesting, both with reference to Hildina and with reference to other Shetland songs. For example, King Orfeo, that was collected in the North Isles, is a Shetland ballad with a Norn refrain. The refrain seems to have very little to do with the song, and again, it's possible that had been done the same way with the refrains being applied to an older song. So I felt very much justified in taking a Faroese ballad melody and applying a Faroese melody refrain to go with the Hildina on the basis of these conversations. And I sat down and I sung Hildina to the various melodies that Anthony had supplied me with. And the one that really stood out was Finnur in Free. It really seemed to fit the melody very, very effectively. And the refrain also just seemed to be a little bit more related to Hildina than the rest. So I selected Finnur in Free, and that really helped to put the final building blocks together and rebuilding Hildina musically. So the refrain that was in the Faroese, and excuse my pronunciation, but Nu sailor edelinger a Norge, Leir renner pirer mellum borda, which translated into English as Now sails the Lord or the nobleman from Norway, gently runs the breeze between the boards. But I felt the translation to Shetland was almost more direct than having to go via English, and I applied New sails the noble lord fra Norway, Blithe runs the purse between the boards. Again, the melody that I eventually chose is the one depicted here. And the way that the Faroese ballads are kind of rendered in musical form, I also found very interesting. I think folk transcribing these melodies are very careful not to ascribe a time signature or very tight bar endings. Instead, it sort of flows through the bars and through a more fluid time signature. But there is a general pulse of 7 beats that does apply. Also, very interestingly and very relevant, between my first trip to Faroe and my second, Viveka Vilupillai and Roy Mully's book on the Shetland language was published. A fascinating book, which is actually written in Shetland. And I was also reading this book. I actually brought it with me on my second trip to Faroe. And it provides a very fresh and interesting way of looking at language. And again, it was very interesting to read in my own language in Shetland about the process of having been educated for 16 years in the English language, and then to find how unusual it can feel reading and writing academically, or reading and writing serious prose in that language can feel a bit difficult at first, but eventually reading in Shetland felt much more easy to take on board than even English. So a fascinating book that I would recommend to anybody. So once my translation was coming together, I prepared a document where I had Norn on one side and Shetland on the other. And I also found it very interesting that if you present English in Shetland, it would be very easy to say, well, Shetland is very similar to the English because there's a lot of words that run the same across both. But if you present Norn and Shetland the same way, the same thing jumps out. There are similarities aplenty between the two versions. Another side effect to my first visit to Faroe was that I became very good friends with Christian Black, and we actually ended up playing a little concert together at the Blow Bar in Faroe, in the Faroe Islands, in Tórshavn. And Christian invited me back to the Faroe Islands in July to perform some concerts at the Summer Toner Festival, which I was obviously very, very keen to do. And it really helped to give me more immersion in Faroese culture and to understand even maybe better how the music and ballad scene works there. So there were 6 performances. I put in an application for funding to the Hope Scott Trust to help me travel to Faroe to do these performances, which they very kindly awarded me. And while I was there was one night without gigs, which happened to be, oh, this video appears to not be working. That's a shame, because I was able to attend the ballad dance at the G Festival.
I think if you click again, it comes up.
Let's see, because it would be nice to see. Oh, there it is. Good. And I'll see if I can actually get that to play. It's not keen to play. Oh, there we go.
Probably will take.
If you want to get the sound, you have to stop sharing and then share again. And on the top right-hand corner, you'll see there's a wee bar where it says include sound.
Interesting. I will do that now because I think it's worth it. So share contact again, include sound, and it's taken me to the so I think, does that take me back to sharing the presentation as it was? Are we good?
It hasn't come up yet.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and reshare again, but I think share screen, go. And how's that? Are we back?
Yes, we're back.
Great, thanks. So yeah, I mean, that gives you a real example of how the young folk in Faroe are very into the ballad tradition, and this is a young and very energetic ballad being danced at the G Festival, and it gives you a very good idea how the ballads feel when everybody's really getting into it. So this was a great chance to see a bit more of that. And a side effect of my visit to Faroe was I was able to arrange a return visit for the Faroese band Spellimenninir, which is Christian Black and Sharon Weiss's band. You can see Christian there on the piano in the picture. And I was able to arrange 3 concerts for them in Shetland, which was a very important thing, I think, to do. As a child, I'd sort of grown up on records of Spellimenninir, and they'd made many visits to Shetland, but I think it's been 10 or 15 years since they'd last been in Shetland. So a very nice thing to arrange, and hopefully part of an ongoing relationship with Faroese music, and the first of many more return visits that I would like to see happen. So the next thing to consider, once the sort of musical rebuilding the ballad was complete, the next step was to record it, and I considerably upped my ambition in this respect, because what I had originally intended to do was to produce a recording myself, but having made the journeys to the Faroe Islands, and to see how the ballads were sung and danced by the community there, it became really obvious to me throughout the year that I was going to have to do a much more elaborate, and I was going to have to get a lot more singers on board than I'd planned. So I put out a major call to Shetland singers and musicians, and I emailed everybody I could think about, and I put out a social media call, and I got a really good response. I had something like 41 singers lined up at one point, and eventually I think natural commitments reduced that to 29, including myself. So I realized that asking people to learn 35 stanzas in the space of about 6 weeks was a very, very big ask. So I split the 29 singers into 5 groups. I assigned 7 verses to each group, and I provided each group with both the Shetland and the Norn text and a recording of me singing a demo of their particular group of verses as well. We used the green room in Mareel, which was recommended by Tim Matthew for Mareel, and we assigned 1 hour 45 minutes per group, which made a very long and productive day from 10:45 until 21:30. And then we went to the lounge bar for a session. So Ken Blair, who I had a very fortunate introduction to back in, I think, August or September last year, was a very accomplished location recording engineer. He offered to come to Shetland and record the project, which I'm very, very grateful to him for doing. And again, the chance to work with somebody like Ken made me up my game and consider how to do the recording on as professional as possible a way. Ken has worked with some of the best names in recording, including George Martin of Beatles fame, Sting, the band Rush, and various classical and jazz names around the world. So Ken travelled up, and we set up at Mareel for the day of recording. And everybody did a great job. The pre-preparation was fantastic. Folk had sat down and listened and worked on the pronunciation. I had lots of lovely emails to reply to sort of hammer out finer points of the pronunciation. And we were able to record the whole thing on 5th of November last year. The recordings are still being prepared at the moment. So they'll be mixed and edited, and then they'll be mastered, and a future step is to get them made available for general listening. But in this slide, I think we should be able to give you a little bit of audio of the Shetland version.
Du tat that little oet, though I saw the blood for his breeze. Du baldus hate that turn me scut, and my rage grew ever more fierce. Nu sails the noble lord in Norway, wide runs the purse atween the bulwarks.
Nu sjö has covered this treachery, both we mull and stin.
Du will never cause the king's denzel ever again. Nu sails the noble lord in Norway, wide runs the purse atween the bulwarks.
So there we go. That was an early version of the recording that we're going to produce. I hope it kind of captures the feel and energy of a Faroese ballad, obviously in a more clinical setting, because we weren't dancing it on the recording. I think asking people to learn to sing it was a really good step at this stage, and dancing it will be something that will happen in the future. Maybe Anthony would say a bit more about this, but the Hildina has been interpreted in different genres. He did make mention of Paul Arne and his band Hamradun, who have made I would say a rock metal version that uses the Hildina, and Mary and Harold Foss have a version that's in a more traditional Norwegian style. Do you have anything to say about those versions, Anthony?
Just that these versions, one, they exist, but two, they are obviously accompanied. So what Barry has done and what we set out to do in our original discussion was to bring it as close to an unaccompanied, danced, sung ballad as possible within that tradition. Of course, you can take a song, you can give it a melody, and you can put instruments to it. And there have been many Faroese bands like Kata, for instance, that have used, or Tyr, that have used Faroese balladry in contemporary style with accompanied instrumentation. But in this sense, we thought that we would move forward as singing would be the front and center.
Absolutely, yeah. And I feel that, yeah, authenticity and being as close as possible to how it might have existed in William Henry's day was at the top of both of our priorities, I think. And something on that respect that I found very interesting actually was that after all the translation work and all the study I did into the various translations and reconstructions of the ballad in Old Norse and in other languages, when it actually came time to sing the ballad to the melody that we'd chosen, when I tried to sing the Norn version of the ballad, the stresses and melody that we were putting it to almost sent me straight back to George Lowe's original transcription of the ballad. So as far as the phonetics of it went, what George Lowe originally wrote down fitted the structure of the melody almost perfectly, and I ended up looking right back at that original transcription, which I felt was quite significant because it kind of confirmed everything that we were doing in a way to me. Another rendering that's been done of the Hildina was by Agnete Christensen, who I think passed away in 2024. She's a friend of a friend, and it's a very lovely version, but again, it's done to a new melody with instrumentation. So yeah, the way forward, because this does feel like the very beginning. It's been rebuilt and can now be sung and performed musically in as close as possible to original Norn and in Shetland. And there's an event that will happen at the Shetland Folk Festival this year, Friday 1st of May in the afternoon. We will be holding a workshop in Lerwick where we will learn the refrains, we'll teach the refrains, and we will get a group together and we will dance the ballad. And this will be the first time that a chain dance has been done to a Shetland ballad in this tradition, certainly in a very long time. I won't quote years, Anthony, would you?
I mean, we never know that, but yeah, it's definitely a couple of 100 years, I would say.
Yeah. The recordings we made last year will be released. They'll certainly be made available digitally, and I'm very keen that they be made available free of charge to any groups, schools, enthusiasts, anybody with an interest in learning and dancing to the Hildina. I'm also considering other formats that might kind of mark the sort of historical nature of this recording as well. But they'll be released in the next few months so that everybody can hear them. Then I think some very clear things that should happen in the future is to build interest in ballad dancing in Shetland. So this Shetland Folk Festival event, again, I hope will be the first of many. In the Faroe Islands, there are ballad dancing groups all over the islands, and it would be incredible if ballad dancing groups were interested in doing the same thing in Shetland. I certainly think one group that would dance ballads would be a very good start, so we'll be looking to gather interest in that. I also feel a good way to spark that off would be to bring some Faroese ballad dancers to Shetland, so that's something I would very much like to do in the near future. Obviously, this all takes money, which means to consider how this might be funded. So bringing Faroese ballad dancers to Shetland would be a great thing, and to get them to teach us some of their ballads and to show us their dancing so that the traditions that were once connected can be as close as possible. And this would obviously then clear the way potentially for Shetland ballad groups to travel to Faroe and see more of the tradition there. So I think there's a whole potential of collaboration that forms for the future. Again, Anthony, do you have any comments to add there?
Just that I don't think when we started this kind of project, we thought that it would engender kind of ambitious roll forwards like it has done. So you when you're in it, you see that there's so much potential to do this. And I didn't say at the beginning, but you know, I met Barry in Scalawa in Shetland because I was actually based in Shetland for the first year of my PhD. And when I went to the archives, I was kind of surprised that the archive was in Edinburgh and not in Shetland, and that when I would ask about the Hildina Ballad, people were not really familiar with what I was talking about. And for me, involved in balladry, I was like, well, why don't you know this? So it feels rather fitting that as I've come to the end of my doctorate, that we are building forward with the Hildina Ballad. It feels like Barry's giving a gift to Shetland with this.
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, we'll move on. Oh yeah, so some of the
very important logo page.
Yeah, yep. So I mean, I would say a big thanks to the University of the Highlands and Islands Institute for Northern Studies and the University of the Faroe Islands for giving us the chance to present on this this project, and also Creative Scotland, who made my part in this possible by giving me the funding to carry out the study and also to travel once to the Faroe Islands to learn more about the tradition. If anybody wants to, I have made my translations available on my webpage. So if anybody wants to see that there is a page on the Hildina at the moment. It could use some revision. I'm never quite up to date with my webpage, but the translations are there and can be downloaded and looked at, and it's just barrynisbet.com. I'm also happy to be contacted by anybody for any thoughts, ideas, collaborations, and that's my email address there, barrynisbetmusic. And I would say a big thanks, in addition to the ones on the previous slide, the Hope Scott Trust for helping me to go to Faroe a second time. I should have said also, well, I have to Christian Black for inviting me back over to Faroe to perform at the Summer Toner Festival. Ken Blair and BMP Recording. Ken basically provided his services in kind, which was very, very, very kind of him. And I was able to bring him to Shetland to carry out the recording to the highest possible standard. So thanks very much to Ken for that. And yeah, thanks to Tota and Carrie for their help, and finally Anthony for making the presentation look good, because I'm a PowerPoint novice.
Yes,
Well,
and I would just second especially thanks to Tota and Kari, and also to Brunhild Kamband in the Faroe Islands for being so welcoming for us in the ballad community, and being able to kind of take Shetland to Faroe and take Faroe to Shetland.
well, thank you very much indeed, Barry and Anthony, for a wonderful presentation and a description of a really fantastic project. I mean, it's really inspiring, and so many potential routes that you can go with this. There is we sometimes finish in an hour, sometimes we go a little bit over. Well, we've gone a little bit over, so there's still time for a few questions. And one of the ones that I'll ask, since I've got the floor, I think you've really got something going here. And if you're going to set up a Shetland ballad singing troupe, you know, you're going to need some other fantastic ballads like the one that you've resurrected and restored. And I wondered if you have other ballads in your sights, because I know that with Jakobsen, when he came to Shetland, he discovered a little bit of the Hugstru Bondi, or Den Hustli and Bondeman ballad, which is that fun one about this poor man, the sort of being browbeaten and told what to do by his wife. So I wondered if that's the sort of thing that you might be looking at, or whether you're thinking of, since the Faroese have adopted some Norwegian and Danish ballads as well, whether you're thinking of maybe using some Faroese ballads and maybe translating them into Shetland.
That's a great question and a great suggestion, actually. I hadn't really got onto the idea of translating a Faroese ballad into Shetland, but I think it's an excellent idea, and it's probably a clear next step if we want to. If we feel that we don't have enough ballads in Shetland, that would be a very clear way forward to remedy that.
You've got a man there who's right into his Faroese ballad, so he can help with the translations.
I mean, we have looked at the jocular ballad you just mentioned. We have discussed it a little bit, but of course, when you're working with Hildina, as you've just seen, there's a lot of different avenues that you can go. So we have a very strong foundation now to push this forward.
Something else I'm very interested in is there's a lot of fragments that Jakobsen collected that have never really been looked at, and I'm very interested to take a closer look at them now. I think he does a fairly interesting rendering of what's commonly known as the Unst boat song, which I feel suggests to me that it's actually a topsail shanty, and I feel there's grounds to look at that as a potential. There's a lot more lines than are commonly sung, and then there's a few other fragments I've been looking at too, which I'm in my own sort of practice as a musician, I'm looking at incorporating into my musical repertoire. So not really ballads, but certainly of interest musically.
Looking forward to those as well. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the recording of the Hildina Ballad as well. So that'll be wonderful when that comes out. There's a question here from Simon. He says the story of Hildina sounds like the plot line to the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones. Is this where G.R.R. Martin got the story, or is this quite a widespread medieval trope?
I think medieval tropes of people getting slaughtered and hacked together and swashbuckling through with swords is quite common. But yes, we definitely see halls being burnt down, potions being drunk, maidens being eloped or kidnapped, depending. Hildina seems to be very much in charge, which is Shetland can be quite proud of, that the female lead in the Hildina Ballad knows what she's doing. So there is a tradition that now has moved towards Upheljar with women in the Jarls groups. So it was there all along.
I feel that's something that jumps out of Hildina to me as well, is the almost it's so nice that it's not a problematic ballad. It doesn't pose any sort of dated stereotypes about and the fact that it even has a line that states, now shall the Lady Hildina work her will as she means to. It actually states that she's got it states that she has free will in what she does next. And the Game of Thrones question is something that I've come back to several times, because there is that moment just when you think the Jarl of Orkney is the hero, bang, his head's been chopped off. So, it's not actually it's not actually him that's the hero of the ballad at all.
Don't get too attached to your characters.
Talking about characters, maybe this be just the last question. There's so many interesting things about the ballad itself, so it's wonderful that it's being resurrected and given back to Shetland. But one thing that just interested me was that Illugi is a hero in a Faroese ballad, Captain Illugi, and also in the Icelandic saga, Illuga Saga Gríðarfostra. He goes off and kills a troll and does a heroic thing. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about why he's an evil.
I wonder if there's this is when I would say that there'll be scholars that might have a better idea, but would there be a factional aspect to this?
I mean, I think it's also names are taken, singers, tradition bearers, they don't necessarily know all the sagas in their head. Some ballads are directly from sagas, but there's always innovations in ballads, and there's always not every ringer or shua is cognizant with another ringer or shua. So yeah, names are taken and put in, and sometimes you're bad and sometimes you're good. It depends on how the ballad singer and tradition bearer wants to paint you. That's the creativity in it. And you see that also in variants. You can have ballad cycles where there are many variants, and in some ballads the characters behave in one way, and in other ballads the characters behave in quite a different way, depending on who's singing and what choices are made. And so yeah.
Interesting stuff. Absolutely. So he's a hero for the Icelanders and the Faroese, but not for the Shetlanders.
Apparently not.
So I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Anthony and Barry. That was really wonderful, very inspiring, and we're definitely looking forward to hearing the recording and also finding out where you're going to go next with this wonderful endeavour, bringing back Shetland's danced ballad tradition. So I wish you all the best with that. So thank you very much indeed. And everyone, I'm sure you've enjoyed that. And if you want to watch it again, the recording will be made available soon on the Institute for Northern Studies website. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.